The three core fundamentals that we're going to discuss are going to be grip, or upper body behind the gun, trigger control, and sight alignment and sight picture. The reason we're distilling our original 7 fundamentals down into 3 core fundamentals is because we're looking for what's going to matter 99% of the time in the real world. It's still very important to understand what the 7 fundamentals are, but we know that we want to be able to execute these 3 core fundamentals as well as possible in any situation we might find ourselves in. The first core fundamental that we're going to be talking about is our upper body behind the gun, or more specifically, our grip. While it is more holistic than just our hands on the gun, and we need to understand all the details that go into establishing a good upper body behind the gun, how we position our upper body, how much tension we set in our core, the position of our shoulders, the position of our elbows, how much tension we set in our wrists, we find that there is most confusion around where we actually place our hands on the gun. So the first thing we're going to discuss is why we like to see our hands in a certain position on the gun. Before we begin to explain why we like hands in a certain place on the firearm itself, we need to understand the mechanics of recoil. We know that recoil is always going to push the gun to where it can most easily move. The job of our grip and our upper body behind the gun is to make sure that we reduce recoil in this firearm to, as much as possible, the slide reciprocating back and forth. In order to cut off these paths of least resistance and ensure that we're minimizing recoil as much as possible and controlling it as well as possible, we want to make sure that we're applying good resistance to both the right and left side of the gun and as high as possible on the line of bore of the gun, or as close to the slide as we possibly can. The first thing that we're looking to do when we pick up a firearm or we draw a firearm from the holster is to establish a high tang grip. Again, driving the firing grip as high up into the tang or the beaver tail of the gun as we possibly can. In establishing that high tang grip, we minimize the amount of leverage that recoil is going to have over our hand. When the round is fired and the slide reciprocates on top of the gun, with a low grip, the reciprocating slide simply has more leverage over the gun. When we obtain that high tang grip and get our hand as close to the slide as possible, we now eliminate some of the leverage that that recoiling mass has over our hand. After I've established my firing grip with my right hand, the next thing that I want to do is make sure that I'm filling in the void on the left side of the gun with my support hand. Placing my support hand in the proper position, I want to make sure that I'm completely filling the void on the left side of the gun. A few key points here. I want to make sure that the first knuckle of my left hand thumb is resting tightly in the curvature of my right hand thumb, and I have good contact portion at the fleshy base of my thumb all the way through my palm. The next core fundamental that we're going to be discussing is trigger control. Put very simply, good trigger control is your ability to break the trigger on the gun without creating any movement in the gun at all. Obviously, there are many details that contribute to movement when we're discussing trigger control. We need to understand taking up the slack or pre-travel, finding the wall, understanding where our trigger resets, but put very simply, we need to be able to hold our sights perfectly still and break the trigger on the gun. In executing good trigger control, we need to understand that we want to take up any slack or pre-travel that might exist in our trigger in order to prep it. Once we find the wall or the place at which the trigger becomes hard, we then need to perform a slow press to the rear, breaking through the wall of the trigger and breaking the shot. The next thing that we want to understand that contributes to good trigger control is understanding trigger reset. After we've broken the shot, we need to make sure that when we let out the trigger, we let out only to where the trigger resets. Once we've let out to where the trigger resets, we can go ahead and begin another press to the rear. Letting the trigger out any further than reset is simply wasted movement. As soon as we've hit the point at which the trigger has reset, we no longer need to go any further and are able to begin another press to the rear. An excellent training tool that helps us understand what good trigger control is dry fire practice. Dry fire practice is simply breaking your trigger on an empty chamber. This acts as a diagnostic tool and allows us to see if we're creating any sort of movement as we perform that slow press to the rear on the trigger. Of course, there are mechanical and safety considerations that we need to think about when doing dry fire practice. Some guns might require the use of a snap cap or dummy round in order to protect the firing pin of the gun. We need to defer to manufacturer's specifications. Obviously, we want to make sure that we're doing our dry fire practice as safely as possible. Once we've mastered holding the gun perfectly still while we perform that slow press to the rear on the trigger, we can do this for repetitions so that it translates over to when we shoot live rounds. The third core fundamental that we're going to be discussing is sight alignment and sight picture. This is simply understanding the relationship between your eyes, the sights on the gun, and the target downrange. When defining sight alignment, we're talking about taking the front post sight and making sure that it is perfectly leveled and centered in the notch in the rear sight. Sight picture is taking those lined up sights and placing them on the target. In understanding that we have depth perception and our eyes have to pick a focal plane to be in, we understand that there are going to be a couple different sight pictures that might be used. We're going to talk about an instinctive sight picture and a precision sight picture. An instinctive sight picture refers to the fact that we are keeping our focus downrange on the target. Therefore, the target is going to be clear and the sights on our gun in the focal plane in front of our face will be out of focus or blurry. A precision sight picture is the exact opposite. Our vision is now in the focal plane where our sights are. Our sights, or more specifically, our front sight, is crystal clear in order to make sure that we are perfectly leveled and centered in our sight alignment, and the target downrange is out of focus or blurry. Obviously, there is no way to be absolute to one sight picture. Based on the environment you're in, the situation you're in, more specifically, your skill level and the distance you're shooting at, you may need to use different sight pictures. One might find an instinctive sight picture where their focus is on the target to be advantageous at a close distance because there is no longer the need to take the time to acquire perfectly leveled and centered sights. Whereas a precision sight picture might be required for a more accurate shot or a shot that's taken at greater distance. Obviously, your skill level and training will determine how one uses these sight pictures. A beginner may find themselves using a precision sight picture or in need of a precision sight picture at closer distances, whereas a more experienced shooter might be able to use something like an instinctive sight picture back to further distances. There's an enormous amount of information and detail to understand when it comes to learning the fundamentals of shooting. It's very important that individuals continue to seek out professional live training to develop their shooting skill set. Hey guys, Nick here from Midwest Carry Academy. We're going to be putting up more and more of our defensive handgun course. This is what we consider kind of our fundamentals course, where we work on our big three fundamentals: our body behind the gun, trigger control, and seeing what you need to see, understanding accuracy, balancing speed and accuracy, working on some basic weapons manipulation, presentation from the holster, different reloads, different malfunctions, and some basic positions and movement. It's a great follow-up course. If you've come and taken ours, you understand the extreme emphasis that we've put on continued training, so we hope to see you guys there.